She stood there in her white dress, smiling at the man she thought she knew, when he leaned in close and whispered for words that would shatter everything. "I love someone else." In that moment, surrounded by 200 guests, Emily Carter's perfect life crumbled like ash in her hands. The morning of June 14th started like every bride dreams it would. Emily woke up to sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains, her bridesmaids already buzzing around with champagne and laughter. Her mother was crying happy tears as she helped button the back of the ivory gown. Everything smelled like roses and expensive perfume. The photographer captured every smile, every hug, every careful application of lipstick. But if you looked closely at the photos later, you could see something in Emily's eyes. A tiny flicker of doubt she'd been ignoring for months. She'd pushed it down, told herself it was just wedding jitters, normal anxiety before the biggest day of your life. When her maid of honor asked if she was ready, Emily nodded and smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. It wasn't entirely true, but she believed it had to be. Hello, friends. Before we dive deeper, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where are you watching from? Florida, United Kingdom, maybe South Africa, or Jamaica. We want to know. What Emily didn't know was that across town, Fred Hayes was sitting in his car outside the church, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white. His phone buzzed with a text message he'd read 17 times already. 3 words that had been haunting him for weeks. His best man knocked on the window, startling him back to reality. "You good, man? We need to get inside." Fred locked his phone, took a breath, and stepped out into the warm summer air. He straightened his tie and forced a smile. In a few hours, everything would change. He just didn't know if he had the courage to go through with what he was about to do. The question that hangs over everything is this: how does a man who claims to love someone stand at an altar and destroy them in front of everyone they know? What drives a person to that moment? And could you forgive someone who did that to you? Emily Carter grew up in a small suburb outside of Philadelphia, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business. She was a teacher at Lincoln Elementary, 3rd grade, and her students adored her. She had this way of making every child feel seen, like they mattered. Her apartment was small but cozy, filled with books and plants she somehow managed to keep alive despite her chaotic schedule. On weekends, she'd meet her sister Rachel for coffee, and they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Emily's life wasn't extraordinary, but it was hers, and she was content. She'd dated here and there, nothing serious, until she met Fred at a mutual friend's barbecue 3 years ago. He was a financial advisor, confident and charming, with an easy smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They started talking about travel, both loved hiking, and before the night ended, he'd asked for her number. Their first date was at a little Italian restaurant downtown. Fred showed up with flowers, pulled out her chair, asked questions about her life like he genuinely cared about the answers. Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the person she'd been waiting for. The first year with Fred felt like a dream. He'd surprise her with weekend trips to the mountains, leave little notes in her lunch bag, text her good morning every single day. Her friends loved him. Her parents loved him. Even her skeptical sister Rachel had to admit he seemed like a good guy. They moved in together after 18 months, a small townhouse with a backyard where they talked about getting a dog someday. Emily started imagining a future: kids, holidays, growing old together. But somewhere around the 2-year mark, things started to shift. Fred worked longer hours, came home distracted, and checked his phone constantly. When Emily asked if everything was okay, he'd kiss her forehead and say he was just stressed about work. She believed him because she wanted to. Because the alternative, that something was wrong, was too frightening to consider. There were small moments that stuck with her later. The time she caught him quickly closing a text message. The weekend he canceled their anniversary trip last minute because of a work emergency. The way he'd started saying, "I love you" less often. And when he did, it sounded automatic, like he was reading from a script. But Emily did what so many of us do. She made excuses, filled in the gaps with hopeful explanations, convinced herself that every relationship goes through rough patches. Then one evening in November, Fred took her to the same restaurant where they'd had their first date. Emily noticed he seemed nervous, fidgeting with his napkin, barely touching his food. When dessert came, he got down on one knee, pulled out a ring, and asked her to marry him. The entire restaurant applauded. Emily said yes through happy tears, and in that moment, all her doubts evaporated. This was proof, wasn't it? Proof that she'd been overthinking everything, that their love was real and strong. The ring was beautiful, a simple solitaire diamond that caught the light. They set a date for the following June, started planning, booked a venue. Emily threw herself into wedding preparations, spending evenings scrolling through Pinterest boards and tasting cakes with her mother. Fred seemed distant during a lot of the planning, but Emily told herself that was normal. Guys don't care about centerpieces and color schemes. He'd show up on the day. That's what mattered. What Emily couldn't see was that Fred had proposed out of obligation, out of fear of losing what was comfortable, out of pressure from everyone around him expecting it. He thought maybe the commitment would rekindle whatever he'd been feeling slip away. He thought maybe he could force himself back into loving her the way he once did. But love doesn't work that way. You can't manufacture it through willpower and good intentions. And Fred was about to learn that lesson in the cruelest way possible. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon at a beautiful old church with stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Emily's father walked her down the aisle to a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon. She could see Fred standing at the altar in his navy suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his face pale. She thought he looked nervous, which was sweet, endearing even. She had no idea he was terrified. The ceremony began. The officiant, an older man named Pastor Williams who'd known Emily's family for years, spoke about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Emily barely heard the words. She was looking at Fred, trying to read his expression, wondering why he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Then came the vows. Pastor Williams turned to Fred first. "Fred, do you take Emily to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" There was a pause, just a beat too long. Emily felt her heart start to race. Fred opened his mouth, and for a second, she thought he was going to say, "I do." Instead, he said, "Can I speak to Emily privately for a moment?" A confused murmur rippled through the church. Pastor Williams looked startled. Emily's mother gasped audibly from the front row. Emily herself felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "Fred, what's going on?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took her hand and led her a few steps to the side of the altar, away from the microphone, but still visible to everyone. 200 people watching in stunned silence. "I'm so sorry," Fred said, his voice shaking. "I can't do this." Emily felt like she was watching the scene from outside her body. Her mouth went dry. Her hands started trembling. "What do you mean you can't do this?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Fred looked down at their joined hands, then finally met her eyes. What he said next would replay in her mind 1,000 times in the months to come. "I've been seeing someone else. I'm in love with her. I thought I could go through with this. I thought I could make it work, but I can't marry you when my heart belongs to someone else. You deserve better than that." The words hung in the air like poison. Emily felt every emotion hit her at once. Shock, humiliation, rage, heartbreak. She pulled her hand away from his like his touch burned. "You're telling me this now?" she said, her voice rising. "At the altar? In front of everyone?" Fred's eyes filled with tears. I know it's horrible. I'm a coward. I should have told you months ago, but I kept thinking it would go away, that I'd get over it. But I can't. I can't lie to you anymore." Emily became aware of the deafening silence in the church. 200 people holding their breath. Her father starting to rise from his seat, his face red with fury. Her mother crying into her hands. Her bridesmaids frozen in shock behind her. The photographer still holding his camera, though he'd stopped taking pictures. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and instead it had become her worst nightmare playing out in public. She thought about slapping him, screaming at him, demanding to know who this other woman was. But instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She took off her engagement ring, placed it carefully in Fred's palm, and closed his fingers around it. "Then go," she said quietly. "Go be with her. I hope she's worth it." Fred stood there for a moment like he wanted to say something else, but there was nothing left to say. He turned and walked down the aisle, past rows of horrified guests, and out the church doors. Just like that, he was gone. Emily stood at the altar in her wedding dress, feeling like a ghost. Pastor Williams didn't know what to do. No one did. Finally, Emily's sister Rachel broke the spell. She rushed up to the altar, threw her arms around Emily, and held her while she started to shake with silent sobs. Emily's father reached them next, his jaw clenched, looking like he wanted to chase Fred down and throttle him. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry." The guests began to move, whispering, gathering their things, not sure if they should leave or stay. Some people tried to approach Emily to offer condolences, but Rachel waved them away. "Give her space," she said firmly. "Just give her space." Emily's mother wanted to cancel the reception entirely, but Emily shook her head. She was still in shock, operating on some kind of autopilot. "All that food," she said numbly. "All those people. We should tell them they can still go to the venue if they want. No sense letting it all go to waste." So that's what they did. About half the guests went to the reception hall, which felt more like a wake than a celebration. Emily didn't go. She couldn't. Instead, Rachel drove her back to the hotel, helped her out of the wedding dress, and held her while she finally, fully broke down and cried for hours. How would you react if someone did this to you? Could you ever imagine humiliating someone you claim to love in front of their entire family and community? What goes through someone's mind to make them think this is acceptable? If you're still watching, comment, "I'm still watching right now." We want to know you're here with us as we continue this story. The days after the wedding that wasn't were the darkest of Emily's life. She took a leave of absence from teaching, couldn't bear the thought of standing in front of her classroom and pretending everything was fine. She stayed with Rachel for the first week because she couldn't face going back to the townhouse she'd shared with Fred. His things were still there, his clothes in the closet, his toothbrush by the sink, reminders of the life they'd built that he'd so casually destroyed. Emily barely ate. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, crying without knowing why she was crying. Her friends tried to reach out, but she couldn't talk about it yet. Every conversation would inevitably circle back to the same questions. Did you have any idea? Who is she? How long was it going on? Emily didn't have answers. Fred had texted her once, 2 days after the wedding. A long, rambling message about how sorry he was, how he never meant to hurt her, how he hoped someday she could forgive him. She deleted it without finishing it. What was there to say? Sorry doesn't put your heart back together. Sorry doesn't give you back the 3 years you spent building a future with someone. Sorry is just a word people use when they want to feel less guilty about the pain they've caused. Emily's mother wanted her to rage, to trash Fred's stuff, to blast him on social media. But Emily felt too empty for anger. She felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out everything inside her and left just a shell. About 3 weeks after the wedding, Emily finally went back to the townhouse. Rachel offered to come with her, but Emily said she needed to do this alone. She walked through rooms that felt like a museum of her old life. The couch where they'd watched movies. The kitchen where they'd cooked dinner together. The bedroom where she'd imagined their future. She started packing Fred's things methodically, putting them in boxes without emotion, like she was sorting inventory. When she found an old photo album from their trip to Colorado, she almost broke down again, but she stopped herself. She'd cried enough. She finished packing, called Fred, and told him coldly to pick up his stuff by the end of the week or she'd donate it all. He came by on a Thursday evening when she wasn't home. Coward until the end. With Fred's presence erased from the townhouse, Emily could finally breathe a little. She threw herself into redecorating, painting walls, buying new furniture, reclaiming the space as hers alone. Her principal called and gently asked when she might be ready to come back. Emily said she needed another month. She wasn't ready to face the pity in her colleagues' eyes, the careful way they'd avoid mentioning relationships or weddings around her. Instead, she started going to a grief counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Hughes who didn't judge or try to rush her healing. Betrayal is a kind of death, Dr. Hughes told her in one session. You're mourning the person you thought Fred was, the future you thought you'd have. That's real grief, and it takes time. Emily also started running, something she'd never done before. She'd wake up at dawn and run until her legs burned and her lungs ached, until she was too tired to think about anything but putting one foot in front of the other. Slowly, painfully, she started to feel like herself again. Not the same self she'd been before Fred, but a different version. Harder maybe, but stronger too. Meanwhile, Fred's life was unraveling in ways he hadn't anticipated. The woman he'd left Emily for was named Jessica, a colleague from his firm. She was beautiful, exciting, Everything that had felt new and thrilling when his relationship with Emily had started feeling stale. But what Fred hadn't realized was that Jessica loved the idea of him more than she loved him. She loved being the other woman, the one worth blowing up a relationship for. Once Fred was actually free, once he publicly humiliated his fiancée and become the villain in everyone's story, Jessica started pulling away. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," she told him one night, 6 weeks after the wedding. "I didn't think you'd actually leave her like that." Fred stared at her in disbelief. "But that's what you wanted. You said you loved me. You said you wanted us to be together." Jessica looked uncomfortable. "I know what I said, but seeing what you did to Emily, how you hurt her, it made me realize what kind of person you are. If you could do that to her, what would stop you from doing it to me?" She broke up with him that night. Fred went home to his sterile new apartment, the place he'd rented after moving out of the townhouse. And for the first time since this all started, he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd done. He'd destroyed Emily. He'd lost Jessica. His parents were barely speaking to him. Most of their mutual friends had chosen Emily's side. His reputation at work had taken a hit because people talked, and now he was known as the guy who dumped his bride at the altar. He'd burned his entire life down for a woman who didn't even want him anymore. The karma was swift and brutal, and it was only just beginning. 6 months after the worst day of her life, Emily Carter walked back into Lincoln Elementary to start a new school year. Her students rushed to hug her, thrilled to have Miss Carter back. She'd missed them more than she realized. Teaching gave her purpose again, reminded her that her value wasn't tied to whether someone loved her or not. These kids needed her. She was making a difference in their lives every single day. Emily also started dating again, casually, nothing serious. She wasn't looking for another relationship, but she was learning to enjoy her own company, to be okay with being alone. She took a pottery class, started volunteering at an animal shelter, adopted a rescue dog named Cooper who slept at the foot of her bed and made her laugh with his goofy personality. One evening, as she sat on her back porch watching the sunset with Cooper's head in her lap, Emily realized something profound. She was happy. Actually, genuinely happy. Not because she'd found someone new, not because Fred had suffered consequences, but because she'd found herself again. She'd learned that she was enough, all on her own, without needing someone else to validate her worth. The betrayal that nearly destroyed her had actually freed her. She'd built a life that was entirely hers, and no one could take that away from her. As for Fred, Emily heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to another city, started over somewhere where people didn't know his story. She hoped he'd learn something from what happened. She hoped he'd become a better person. But honestly, she didn't think about him much anymore. He was a chapter in her story, but he wasn't the whole book. And that, Emily thought, was the real victory. So here's what I want you to think about. If you were Emily's friend, what would you have told her to do? Could you have forgiven Fred, or would you have done exactly what Emily did? And have you ever had someone betray you so completely that you didn't think you'd survive it, but somehow you came out stronger? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week, real human experiences that remind us we're not alone in our struggles. Thank you for watching. And remember that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for becoming the person you were always meant to be.